Imagine a horizon that never changes. A wall of gray fog, thick with the scent of brine and the heavy metallic tang of oxidizing iron. Out of the mist, a ghost emerges. It is a silhouette that should be familiar to any student of history. The long, elegant bow and the towering superstructure of an Iowa-class battleship. But this is not the pristine museum piece you might visit in Pearl Harbor or Camden. This ship is bleeding. The hull is a patchwork of salt-pitted steel and weeping rust. The once proud teak decks are bleached white by the sun and splintered by years of neglect. It is 1952, and for the men aboard this vessel, the Second World War didn't end 7 years ago. It never ended at all. Welcome to the dark timeline. In our history, the surrender of Japan in August 1945 brought a definitive close to the most cataclysmic conflict in human memory. But here, the timeline fractured. The decisive battle, the one final apocalyptic clash that both sides believed would force a conclusion, never arrived. Instead, the Pacific became the site of a decade-long naval siege, a grinding, stagnant war of attrition that the world simply could not find a way to stop. From the outside, the battleship remains an icon of sheer, unadulterated power. 45,000 tons of American industrial might, bristling with 16-inch guns capable of hurling shells the weight of a car over the horizon. It is a floating fortress, a citadel of the sea. But as we move past the armor plating and descend into the bowels of the ship, the cinematic grandeur evaporates, replaced by a suffocating, claustrophobic reality. 2,700 men are crammed into a space designed for a crew 2/3 that size. They are living in the cracks between the machinery, sleeping in the shadow of the massive barbettes, breathing air that has been recycled through the lungs of 1,000 other sailors before it reaches them. There is no privacy here. There is no silence. There is only the perpetual hum of the generators and the rhythmic, bone-deep thrum of the propeller shafts. In this world, these ships are no longer symbols of national pride. They aren't the gray ladies that saved democracy. They have become inescapable prisons of necessity. The men who walked onto these decks as boys in 1944 are now tired, hollowed-out veterans who haven't seen a civilian peer in years. They are the inhabitants of a floating iron tomb, kept alive only by the very steel that keeps them captive. To understand how the world reached this point, we have to look back to the moment the clock stopped, the pivot point of 1946, when the promise of home became a lie. In the world we know, the end was sudden. A flash of light over Hiroshima, a second over Nagasaki, and the scratching of pens on the deck of the USS Missouri. Operation Downfall, the massive two-pronged invasion of the Japanese home islands that would have cost millions of lives, remained a terrifying what-if buried in the archives of the Pentagon. The war ended before the first American boot could touch the soil of Kyushu. But in this timeline, the flash never came. July 16, 1945, the Jornada del Muerto Desert, New Mexico. The Trinity test, the world's first nuclear explosion, is a catastrophic failure. The plutonium core fails to compress correctly. The most expensive scientific endeavor in human history ends not with a blinding light, but with the hollow click of a firing mechanism and a pathetic cloud of conventional smoke. The atomic bomb is a dud, a billion-dollar ghost. Suddenly, the shortcut to peace is gone. The American High Command is left with a choice between two nightmares: a meat grinder invasion that would soak the Pacific in a generation's worth of blood, or a total, unrelenting naval blockade. They choose the latter. They call it a siege. They believe that by choking off every scrap of food and every drop of oil, the enemy will break in months. They are wrong. By the spring of 1946, the stalemate of the Pacific has solidified into a grim geopolitical reality. The Japanese home islands have become a fortress of starvation, digging into the mountains and refusing to yield, while the United States Navy is tethered to their shores. The fleet cannot move. It cannot rest. To pull back even 100 miles would be to allow the enemy to breathe, to resupply, and to strike back with the remnants of their air power. The Iowa-class battleships, designed for high-speed carrier escort and thunderous surface combat, are repurposed into permanent sentinels. In our history, a naval deployment lasted 6 to 9 months before a crew returned to a hero's welcome. In this world, the term deployment is replaced by permanent station. The ships are no longer moving toward a destination. They are simply existing at a fixed point on a chart, 1,000-mile-long supply chains feeding them just enough fuel and ammunition to keep their guns pointed at the horizon. The sailors who boarded these ships in the optimism of 1944, expecting to be home for Christmas, find themselves still staring at the same stretch of gray water in 1947, 1948, 1950. The concept of home begins to drift, transforming from a physical place into a half-remembered myth. They aren't visitors to the Pacific anymore. They are its permanent residents, locked inside a steel ecosystem that was never meant to sustain human life for this long. The ship is no longer a weapon. It is a house that won't let you leave. And as the years bleed together, the physical toll of this eternal siege begins to manifest in the most intimate, suffocating ways imaginable. It starts where every sailor's day begins and ends, in the berthing compartments. To understand the psychological erosion of the crew, you have to understand the rack. In the real U.S. Navy of the 1940s, space was a luxury the designers simply couldn't afford. They utilized a system known as hot bunking. It's a simple, brutal piece of logistics. 3 men are assigned to 2 beds. While one man is on watch and another is working, the third sleeps. When the whistle blows and the shifts rotate, the man who was sleeping is kicked out, and the man coming off duty crawls into the still warm indentation left behind. In this dark timeline, the hot in hot bunking isn't a figure of speech. It is a physical, clinging reality. The mattress never has time to cool. It never has time to dry. It becomes a sponge for the collective sweat, oil, and skin cells of a dozen different men over a dozen different months. But as the blockade of the Japanese home islands stretches into its 3rd year, the crowding reaches a catastrophic breaking point. In our history, an Iowa-class battleship might carry 2,700 men at its absolute peak. In this timeline, the constant threat of special attack craft and the need for 24-hour vigilance have forced the Navy to cram an additional 40% more personnel into the hull. Extra anti-aircraft batteries have been bolted to every square inch of the teak deck, and every gun needs a crew. The ship is now a hive of nearly 4,000 souls. The berthing compartments, designed for a semblance of rest, have become sensory chambers of horror. Imagine a room the size of a standard garage, stacked 5 high with canvas bunks held together by frayed rope. The ceiling is so low that if you roll over too quickly, you'll bruise your shoulders on the steel pipes and electrical conduits above. There is no such thing as a breeze. The air is a thick, stagnant soup of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, and the pungent, vinegary scent of fungal infections that no one can seem to cure. Humidity clings to the bulkheads like a second skin, dripping from the overhead cables onto your face while you try to snatch 4 hours of fitful sleep. But the physical discomfort is nothing compared to the death of the soul. In this floating iron tomb, privacy is a dead concept. You are never, for a single second of your life, alone. You dress in a crowd. You eat in a crowd. You wash in a row of open basins with your shoulders touching the men beside you. Even your dreams are interrupted by the rhythmic snoring, the grinding of teeth, and the muttered prayers of the 3,000 other men trapped in the same nightmare. Psychologists call it crowding stress, but the sailors just call it the itch. It's the feeling that your own mind is being squeezed out of your skull by the sheer mass of humanity pressing in from all sides. By 1948, the men have forgotten what it feels like to have a private thought. Every internal reflection is shattered by a boot hitting the deck or a shouted order. After 3 years without a moment of solitude, the mind begins to fracture. The eyes take on a glazed, distant look, not from the terror of battle, but from the simple, agonizing realization that you will never be alone again until the day you die and are sewn into a weighted shroud. And yet, as suffocating as the crowds are, they are only half of the misery. Because while the air in the berthing decks is thick with the breath of 4,000 men, it is also getting hotter. The ship is no longer just a prison. It is becoming an oven. To understand the agony of life on an Iowa-class battleship in 1947, you have to understand the physics of steel. These ships were never designed for comfort. They were designed for invulnerability. They are 45,000 tons of high-tensile steel floating in the middle of a tropical ocean where the sun beats down with a relentless, blinding fury for 12 hours a day. In our timeline, the lack of air conditioning was a hardship. In the dark timeline, it is a slow-motion execution. By noon, the teak-planked main deck is hot enough to blister bare skin. But the real horror isn't on the surface. It's beneath it. As the sun cooks the hull, the heat radiates inward, trapped by the very armor plating designed to protect the crew from enemy shells. The ship becomes a giant heat sink, an iron radiator that never cools down, even after the sun slips below the horizon. If you descend into the bowels of the ship, the fire rooms and engine spaces, the environment shifts from uncomfortable to lethal. Here, the temperature rarely drops below 120 degrees Fahrenheit. On the days when the boilers are pushed to maintain speed against a rising tide or an incoming threat, the mercury hits 135. The Black Gang, the engineers who live in this subterranean hell, work in shifts that feel like penance. They are perpetually slick with a mixture of salt, sweat, and lubricating oil, their skin perpetually broken out in heat rashes that never heal because the skin never stays dry. They don't just breathe the air, they swallow it. It is a thick, metallic vapor that sears the lungs and turns every breath into a conscious effort. Then there's the galley, Imagine trying to prepare meals for 4,000 men in a space the size of a small school cafeteria, surrounded by steam-jacketed kettles and roaring industrial ovens, with no windows and failing ventilation. The mess cooks are walking ghosts, their skin pale and pruned from the constant humidity, moving in a daze through a fog of boiling grease and stagnant steam.
But here is where the dark timeline turns the screws. In the real 1945, the U.S. Navy had an almost infinite supply of fuel oil. In this world, the stalemate has dragged on for years, and the supply lines are stretched to the breaking point. Every drop of oil is a strategic asset. To keep the massive Mark 13 radar arrays spinning and the fire control computers humming, the command makes a brutal utilitarian calculation. The ventilation fans are cut to minimum essential to save power. The constant hum of the fans, which used to be the heartbeat of the ship, dies out in sector after sector. The silence that follows is more terrifying than the noise. Without moving air, the heat pools. It stagnates. It becomes a physical weight pressing against your chest, making the simple act of standing feel like a marathon. You see men standing under air vents that have gone cold, staring upward with a vacant, desperate hope, waiting for a puff of air that will never come. This is where steel deck madness takes root. Heat doesn't just exhaust the body, it dissolves the civilian mind. Tempers that were already frayed by the suffocating lack of privacy now ignite over the smallest spark. A man taking too long at the scuttlebutt for a sip of lukewarm metallic water. A bunkmate whose sweat drips onto the man sleeping below him. In the sweltering dark of the berthing decks, whispers turn into snarls, and snarls turn into sudden, irrational bursts of violence. The officers try to maintain the facade of discipline, but even they are wilting, their starch-white uniforms yellowed and sodden, their authority evaporating in the 100-degree humidity of the wardroom. The ship is a pressurized vessel of human rage, slowly being brought to a boil by the very sun that should be their guide. And as the internal temperature rises, the physical constitution of the crew begins to fail. The men are burning up from the inside, but their bodies are beginning to wither from the lack of the one thing that could keep them fighting: real, life-sustaining sustenance. In this iron oven, the menu is about to become as grim as the climate. The heat is a predator, but hunger is the parasite. As the internal temperature of the ship climbs, the body's metabolism demands fuel, yet the galley has nothing left to offer but the remnants of a dying empire. In the real 1945, the United States Navy was a logistical miracle, a floating cornucopia that provided its sailors with fresh meat, baked bread, and even dedicated ice cream barges in the middle of a combat zone. But in the dark timeline, that miracle has been strangled. The culprit is a shadow beneath the waves, the Koryu. These long-range midget submarines, produced by the thousands in hidden coastal caves, have turned the Pacific into a gauntlet of attrition. The great soaring supply convoys of 1944 are gone, replaced by desperate, armored runners that rarely make it through the blockade. For the 2,700 men aboard this Iowa-class Titan, fresh meat is no longer a meal, it is a myth. A story told by the older chiefs about the world before the stalemate. The last time a cow was slaughtered for this crew was in the autumn of 1945. Now, the menu is a grim cycle of SOS, creamed chipped beef on toast. But even the beef has changed. It is no longer the salted product of American plains, but a gray, gelatinous mystery scraped from rusted tins, heavy with the metallic tang of the container. When the tins run out, the crew turns to K-rations, wax-wrapped boxes of dehydrated crackers, processed cheese that looks like yellow plastic, and 4-year-old cigarettes that crumble into dust the moment they are lit. The only thing keeping the crew's hearts beating is bug juice, a synthetic neon-colored powder mixed with lukewarm, distilled seawater. It is supposed to be fortified with vitamins, a chemical defense against the ancient ghosts of the sea. But the fortification isn't enough. By the late 1940s, the ship is haunted by a disease the Navy thought it had conquered centuries ago: scurvy. It starts in the mouth. Gums become soft and spongy, turning a bruised purple. Then, the teeth begin to loosen in their sockets, rattling like dice in a cup. Old wounds, scars from shrapnel or childhood accidents, start to spontaneously reopen, the body literally unraveling because it lacks the vitamin C to hold its own tissues together. You see sailors leaning against the bulkheads, their skin covered in petechiae, tiny red spots where the capillaries are bursting under the skin. They move with a heavy, leaden lethargy, their minds clouded by a nutritional fog that makes even the simplest order feel like an impossible burden. This is the ultimate, bitter irony of the dark timeline. You are standing on the most powerful weapon ever conceived by a man. You are surrounded by 9 16-inch guns capable of leveling a city, protected by a citadel of Class A armor steel that can withstand a direct hit from a heavy cruiser. This ship cost over $100 million in 1940s currency, billions in today's money. It is a masterpiece of engineering, a pinnacle of human ambition. And yet, for all its terrifying power, it cannot provide its crew with the one thing they would trade their souls for: a single, fresh orange. As the malnourished crew stares out at the horizon, their eyes sunken and their ribs beginning to show through sweat-stained dungarees, the ship continues its endless patrol. The hunger is a dull ache, but it is soon to be drowned out by a different kind of assault. Because while the body is starving, the senses are being pulverized by a machine that never sleeps. Even if you could ignore the hunger, your body wouldn't let you rest. A battleship is a living, breathing machine of violence, and it is never, ever quiet. In our history, a sailor might endure the cacophony of battle for a few hours or days before returning to the relative peace of a harbor. In the dark timeline, the noise is a life sentence. It starts with the hum. A battleship is powered by massive steam turbines and electrical generators that never stop. It is a 60-cycle vibration that crawls up through the soles of your boots, into your shins, and settles deep in your marrow. It is the sound of 45,000 tons of steel vibrating at a frequency that makes your teeth ache in their sockets. You don't just hear the ship, you feel it. It's in the way your coffee ripples in the mug, the way the rivets groan in the bulkheads, and the way the air itself seems to thrum with a low-frequency growl that never, for 1 second, relents. But the hum is merely the backdrop for the real assault. In this decade-long siege, the 16-inch guns have transitioned from weapons of decisive engagement to tools of psychological torture. To prevent the enemy from repairing coastal airfields or moving supplies under the cover of darkness, the Iowa-class ships are ordered to maintain harassment fire. This means that every hour on the hour, for years on end, a turret rotates, the massive barrels elevate, and a 2,000-pound high-explosive shell is hurled into the night. The concussion of a 16-inch gun is not a sound. It is a physical blow. It is a wall of compressed air that slams into the chest of every man on deck, knocking the wind from their lungs and shattering any glass not reinforced with wire. Below decks, the shock wave travels through the steel like a lightning bolt. Light bulbs explode. Paint chips fly off the walls like shrapnel.
For the men sleeping in the berthing compartments directly beneath the turrets, it is like being trapped inside a giant bell while a titan strikes it with a sledgehammer. By 1949, the crew of this floating fortress is a collection of the walking deaf. High-frequency hearing is the first thing to go, replaced by a permanent, high-pitched ringing, tinnitus, that screams in their ears during the rare moments of quiet. You see 20-year-old sailors with the 1,000-yard stare, their eyes wide and unfocused, their faces frozen in a mask of shell-shocked indifference. They no longer flinch when the guns fire. They don't even blink. They have been hollowed out by the constant pressure, their nervous systems fried by years of acoustic trauma. The sensory assault bleeds into the soul. The smell of cordite, the acrid, sulfurous scent of burnt gunpowder, becomes their only perfume. It permeates their hair, their skin, and the very blankets they sleep under. Their world is a monochromatic blur of gray steel, yellow muzzle flashes, and the stinging blue smoke of the anti-aircraft batteries. But as the years grind on, the sailors realize something even more terrifying than the noise. They become so conditioned to the mechanical roar of the ship that the prospect of its stopping becomes a source of primal dread. In this dark timeline, silence doesn't mean peace. Silence means the engines have failed. Silence means the power is out. Silence means you are a sitting duck in a vast, hostile ocean. On the Iowa, the noise is the only proof that you are still alive. And as the ship begins to fail under the weight of its own existence, that silence is beginning to creep in from the edges. The silence of a failing machine is a death rattle. But for the crew of the Iowa, the most immediate threat isn't the engines stopping, it's the water running dry. In the real history of the United States Navy, fresh water was always a precious commodity, governed by a brutal mechanical logic. The boilers always came first. A battleship is a steam-powered beast, and its heart requires pure, distilled water to survive. If the boilers scale over with salt, the ship dies. The men, by comparison, are an afterthought. In our dark timeline, by the year 1949, the ship's desalination plants, the evaporators, have been screaming at maximum capacity for 4 years without a break. These machines were designed for periodic maintenance in a shipyard, not for a decade of non-stop siege. The brass pipes are pitted with salt, the gaskets are brittle, and the spare parts were exhausted years ago. The engineers have resorted to cannibalizing secondary cooling systems just to keep the primary distillers coughing out enough water to keep the ship moving. The human cost of this mechanical failure is devastating. The legendary Navy shower, a 30-second burst of water to lather and rinse, is no longer a daily ritual. It is a luxury granted once a week if the evaporators are holding. When they aren't, the crew is forced to use the saltwater taps. Washing in seawater with sea soap is a miserable experience. The soap refuses to lather, and it leaves a sticky, crystalline film on the skin that never truly dries in the humid bowels of the ship. This is where the rust plague begins. It starts in the dark, airless corners of the berthing compartments, where nearly 3,000 men are packed into a space meant for two-thirds that number. It starts as a simple itch between the toes, or a rash in the groin. But in the 100-degree heat of the stagnant Pacific air, it evolves into deck rot. It is a virulent fungal infection that thrives on unwashed skin and damp, salty fabric. It turns feet into raw, weeping sores and spreads across the torso in angry red maps.
With no fresh laundry and no way to dry their uniforms, the men are literally rotting inside their clothes. The sickbay is no longer treating shrapnel wounds. It is a ward for men whose skin is peeling away in gray flakes, mirroring the very ship they inhabit. Because the ship itself is suffering from its own version of the plague. In our world, a battleship is a marvel of maintenance, constantly chipped, primed, and painted. In this timeline, the supply of haze gray paint ran out years ago. The salt spray of the Pacific is a slow-motion acid, and without the ability to dry dock, the rust is no longer a cosmetic issue. It is structural. It bubbles up under the linoleum floors and eats through the ventilation ducts, blowing a fine orange powder of oxidized steel into the lungs of the sleeping crew. The men breathe the ship, and the ship drinks the men. Every drop of sweat, every breath of humid air contributes to the slow, corrosive transformation of the interior into a jagged, rusted tomb. The Iowa is no longer a pristine instrument of national power. It is a crumbling, salt-stained gargoyle. The teak wood decks, once scrubbed white, are now black with oil and green with algae. There is a new smell that competes with the cordite now, the cloying, sweet stench of infected skin mixed with the metallic tang of deep-seated corrosion. The sailors look at the bulkhead next to their bunks and see the rust bubbling like a skin disease, then look at their own hands and see the same decay. The ship is no longer just their home. It is an organism that has turned parasitic, consuming its crew to stay afloat. The rust isn't just eating the steel. It's eating the chain of command. In the United States Navy, the divide between the wardroom and the lower decks has always been a matter of tradition and necessity. Officers lead. Enlisted men execute. But after 7 years without a home port, that divide has sharpened into a razor-edged class war. On a ship like the Iowa, officer country is more than just a set of cabins. It is a gated community in a floating slum. While the enlisted men are packed into berthing compartments that feel like steam rooms, the officers' quarters are located higher in the superstructure. They catch the stray breezes that the ventilation fans can no longer push to the lower decks. While the crew survives on dehydrated K rations and a slurry of bug juice that tastes of chemicals and rot, the wardroom still occasionally sees the luxury of a real potato or a tin of peaches, held back from the general mess to maintain command morale. To a sailor who hasn't seen a fresh vegetable since 1946, the scent of real coffee wafting from the officer's galley is no longer a sign of authority. It is a betrayal. This is the hierarchy of steel. The social contract of the ship, the idea that every man suffers equally for the mission, has been dissolved by time and deprivation. The junior officers, many of whom were children when the war began, now find themselves commanding old salts who have been at their battle stations longer than the officers have been in uniform. Respect has been replaced by a simmering, silent resentment. The lower decks are a powder keg of steel deck madness, where a misplaced word or perceived slight over a ration of water can lead to a brawl that the master-at-arms can barely suppress. Because of this, the role of the Marine detachment has undergone a chilling transformation. In our history, the Marines on a battleship were there to man the secondary batteries and provide security for the ship's vital centers. In the dark timeline, they have become a Praetorian Guard.
Their primary duty is no longer defending the ship from the enemy. It is defending the officers from the crew. You see them now in the passageways, standing guard at the hatches leading to the bridge and the wardroom. They don't look out at the horizon for kamikazes. They look down the long, dim corridors at the groups of hollow-eyed sailors whispering in the shadows. They carry loaded sidearms and batons, their faces set in masks of grim indifference. The Marines are the only ones who still have crisp uniforms, a final psychological barrier meant to project an order that no longer truly exists. The Iowa has become a microcosm of a collapsing society. It is a city-state of 2,700 souls, where the zip code is defined by how many decks you live below the waterline. At the top, a dwindling elite struggles to maintain the illusion of a functioning military unit.
At the bottom, a desperate, malnourished workforce keeps the heart of the beast beating, fueled by a mixture of habit, fear, and the knowledge that if the engines stop, they all die together. The ship is no longer a weapon of war. It is a pressure cooker with the lid welded shut. And yet, despite the hunger, the rot, and the looming threat of mutiny, the machine must be fed. The hierarchy remains because the alternative is total mechanical failure. If the sailors stop working, the rust wins. If the officers stop leading, the ship drifts. In this dark reality, the most terrifying thing isn't the enemy on the horizon. It's the man standing next to you in the dark, and the realization that the only thing keeping the ship afloat is a ritual of maintenance that has become a matter of life or death. The Iowa is a biological organism made of 45,000 tons of steel, and like any living thing, it is constantly trying to die.
Salt water is a universal solvent, a relentless enemy that eats at every weld, every bolt, and every valve. In our history, maintaining a battleship required thousands of man-hours every single day, a never-ending cycle of chipping paint, greasing joints, and testing valves. But in the dark timeline, this routine maintenance is transformed from a chore into a desperate, high-stakes battle for survival. By 1949, the supply chains from the American mainland have been stretched to the breaking point. Specialized spare parts for the massive 16-inch guns are no longer arriving. The factories back home have shifted their focus to the desperate production of simpler, cheaper weapons for a war that refuses to end. On the Iowa, the machine shop has become the most important room on the ship. Here, machinists work by the dim, flickering light of failing bulbs, trying to fabricate complex gears and bushings out of scrap metal and salvaged brass. The crew has entered the era of the great cannibalization. The ship is slowly eating itself to stay alive. To keep the primary fire control computers operational, sailors have stripped the vacuum tubes from the ship's internal entertainment systems and non-essential radios. To patch a high-pressure steam leak in Engine Room 3, engineers have cut sections of piping from the crew's washrooms, leaving hundreds of men with no way to wash away the toxic grime of the bilge. They are dismantling the vessel's secondary systems
to keep its primary heart beating. This isn't just about the loss of comfort. It is about the thin, razor-edged line between a functioning weapon and a catastrophic explosion. On a battleship, there is no such thing as busy work. Every grease fitting on a turret's training gear must be checked with religious fervor. In this exhausted, sleep-deprived state, a single missed lubrication point can cause a massive gear to seize under the incredible torque of the rotating turret. If that happens during a firing sequence, the result isn't just a mechanical failure, it is a death sentence. A jammed turret can cause a backflash of fire into the powder hoist, igniting thousands of pounds of silk-bagged propellant in the handling rooms below. In an instant, 100 men are vaporized, not by an enemy shell, but by a 10-cent part that failed because a 19-year-old sailor fell asleep on his feet. The stakes of maintenance have become absolute. Every clank of a wrench and every hiss of a leaking steam line is a reminder that the ship is barely holding together. The sailors no longer look at the Iowa with pride. They look at it with a weary, fearful vigilance. They are the caretakers of a dying giant. The ship has become a zombie, a hollowed-out, rusted husk that continues to move only because of the sheer, desperate willpower of a crew that knows if the machine stops, the ocean will claim them all. The Iowa is no longer sailing toward victory. It is simply struggling to stay afloat for one more hour, one more day, in a world that has forgotten the sound of silence. The alarm does not scream, it stings. In the dark timeline of 1948, the general quarters siren on the USS Iowa has become a physiological trigger that bypasses the brain and goes straight to the adrenal glands. It is a sound that has haunted the crew for 3 years without reprieve. In the real history of 1945, the kamikaze was a terrifying but finite phenomenon, a desperate final gasp of a dying empire. But in this reality, the divine wind never stopped blowing. It simply became more efficient, more hidden, and infinitely more psychological. By 1948, the enemy has retreated into the labyrinthine coastal caves of the home islands, launching the improved Oka Type 43. In our world, these rocket-powered piloted bombs were a rare sight. Here, they are mass-produced in subterranean factories, launched from hidden rail systems tucked into the jagged cliffs. They don't fly in the traditional sense. They drop from the clouds at near-sonic speeds, a streak of silver and fire that gives a lookout less than 10 seconds to react. This is the Kamikaze Shadow. It is a permanent eclipse of the soul. For the sailors on the Iowa, the threat is no longer a battle to be won, but a condition to be endured. Because the Oka can appear at any moment of any day, the ship remains in a state of near-permanent general quarters. On the 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft mounts, crews live in their harnesses. They are literally strapped to their weapons for 48 hours at a time. The physical toll is grueling, but the psychological erosion is worse. Men sleep in their gun tubs, their heads resting on cold steel, dreaming of the horizon. They eat cold K rations while their eyes remain fixed on the clouds, their fingers twitching on the triggers. Every whitecap on the waves, every stray bird, every glitch on the aging radar screen is a potential suicide strike. The tension is a physical weight, a tightening in the chest that never releases. There is a specific kind of madness that takes hold after the 100th false alarm, the steel deck stare. You see it in the eyes of the 20-year-old gunners. They no longer look for the enemy, they wait for him. They have been waiting for years. In this timeline, the greatest weapon used against the U.S. Navy isn't the high explosive in the nose of a piloted bomb. It is the anticipation of that explosion. The silence between attacks is more terrifying than the roar of the guns. In the silence, the mind begins to fracture.
Every creak of the Iowa's rusted hull sounds like a launching rail. Every hiss of the ventilation sounds like a rocket motor. The crew is caught in a loop of eternal vigilance, a cycle of adrenaline and exhaustion that has turned the pride of the fleet into a ship of ghosts. They are strapped into their guns, waiting for a hit that could come in the next 10 seconds, or the next 10 months. They are no longer sailors. They are the human components of a weapon system that is slowly grinding them into dust. And as the sun sets over a Pacific that has become a graveyard of ships and sanity, the shadow only grows longer. For months, the men on the Iowa live for a single word whispered through the humid berthing compartments like a prayer. Ulithi. In our history, this remote atoll in the Caroline Islands was a sanctuary, the Pacific's Secret Service station. It was a place where a sailor could briefly escape the steel walls, feel the grit of sand between his toes, and perhaps enjoy 2 cans of lukewarm beer on a beach. But in this dark timeline, where the blockade is stretched into a decade-long siege, Ulithi has transformed into something unrecognizable. It is no longer a sanctuary. It is a purgatory of salt and rust. The Island of No Return is the nickname given to the base by the crews of the 1950s. As the Iowa pulls into the lagoon, the sailors don't see a tropical paradise, they see a floating slum. Thousands of ships, from massive carriers to tiny fleet tugs, are packed into the anchorage, some having not moved under their own power in years. The water, once a vibrant turquoise, is now a thick, iridescent slick of bilge water, spilled fuel oil, and the concentrated waste of 100,000 men. The smell is a nauseating cocktail of tropical decay and industrial exhaust that hangs heavy in the stagnant air. When the men finally get their shore leave, the reality is a crushing disappointment. They are ferried to Mogmog, or one of the other small islands. But the palm trees are long gone, harvested for timber or destroyed by the constant expansion of supply depots. The beach is a strip of bleached coral and packed dirt, overcrowded with thousands of sailors from a dozen different task forces. There is no shade. There is no quiet. There is only the atoll fever, a mixture of malaria, fungal infections, and the sheer, blinding heat that radiates off the sand. It is here, standing on a sun-scorched sandbar, surrounded by the rusted skeletons of the fleet, that the final psychological blow lands. The realization sinks in that there is no home to return to. In the real 1945, the mail buoys were full of letters promising a world of refrigerators, new cars, and suburban peace. In this timeline, the mail has slowed to a trickle. The letters that do arrive speak of a United States that has become a grim, militarized fortress. The sisters and sweethearts the men left behind in the early 40s are now middle-aged women, their lives consumed by factory shifts and the rationing of every scrap of rubber and tin. The sailors look at the Iowa, looming like a gray mountain in the oily lagoon, and they see it for what it truly is, their only reality. The myth of the return has died. They have become the ghost fleet, a generation of men who have spent their entire adulthood within the confines of a weapon. They are no longer citizens of a country.
They are subjects of the ship. When the signal flags go up and the Iowa is ordered back to the blockade line, many men don't even look back at the shore. There is no longing left for the land. The war has not just taken their years. It has consumed the very memory of peace. As the anchor chain rattles upward, bringing with it the stench of the lagoon's bottom, they realize the ship isn't taking them back to the fight. It is taking them back to the only home they have left. By 1950, the American industrial machine, once thought to be an inexhaustible fountain of steel and fire, begins to choke. 10 years of total war have turned the United States into a hollowed-out shell, a nation where every scrap of metal is worth its weight in gold. The massive Iowa-class battleships, once the glittering jewels of the fleet, are now seen by the War Production Board as floating mines of raw material. They are too vital to decommission, their 16-inch guns the only things keeping the enemy's coastal fortresses at bay. But they are also too heavy, too luxurious for a world that has forgotten the meaning of the word. The orders that arrive in the early months of 1951 are a psychological death knell for the crew. They are told to strip the citadel. It begins with the aesthetics. The beautiful hand-laid teak decks, designed to provide traction and insulate the living spaces below, are deemed a fire hazard and a waste of resources. Sailors who once spent hours holostoning that wood to a pristine white are now ordered to rip it up with crowbars. The wood is crated and sent back to the States, not for furniture, but to be burned as industrial fuel or used in the construction of cheap, temporary barracks. Beneath the wood, the bare steel is exposed, cold, rusted, and dangerously slick when wet. Then, the brass raid begins. Every non-essential fitting, door handles, plaques, decorative trim, even the brass casings of the ship's clocks, is unscrewed and tossed into melting pots. The Iowa is losing its shine, literally and figuratively. The warm golden glow of the officers' country and the polished fixtures of the enlisted mess are replaced by jagged steel and rough cast iron. The ship is starting to look less like a vessel of war and more like a factory floor. But the stripping goes deeper. To save weight for more ammunition and new radar arrays, the comfort items are next. Padded chairs, library books, and even the frames of the bunks in the lower berthing areas are removed. The steel from the bunk frames is needed for the hulls of a new generation of destroyers. The sailors of the Iowa are left to sleep on the cold, vibrating deck plates or in hammocks slung between steam pipes, just as their ancestors did in the Age of Sail. The ship is becoming a skeleton. Without the wood and the insulation, the noise inside the hull becomes unbearable. Every clanging wrench, every hum of a pump, and every footfall echoes through the hollowed-out compartments like a scream in a cavern. The temperature regulation fails entirely. The citadel is now a convection oven in the day and a meat locker at night. The men watch as their home is slowly dismantled around them. They realize that the nation they are fighting for no longer sees them as heroes to be supported, but as occupants of a resource that must be optimized. The ship is losing its humanity, its soul being traded for shell casings and fuel oil. As the Iowa sits low in the water, its gray paint peeling to reveal the red lead primer beneath, it looks like a bleeding giant. It is no longer a symbol of pride. It is a zombie a dead thing kept upright by the desperate needs of a dying era. And as the crew huddles on the bare steel floors, they realize the ship isn't just their prison anymore. It's being stripped down to its barest, most violent essence, preparing them for a final, terrible purpose. By the winter of 1952, the Pacific has become a graveyard of ambition. For 7 long years, the Iowa and her sisters have sat in the blockade lines, rotting from the inside out, waiting for a peace that never arrived. But the stalemate cannot last forever.
The economy back home is a shadow of its former self, and the enemy's resolve has only hardened in the face of a decade of starvation. The High Command in Washington, desperate to end the eternal war before the country collapses under the weight of its own military, decides on a final, terrifying gamble. They call it a strategic insertion, but the men on the lower decks know the truth. It is a suicide run. The order that flashes across the Iowa's radio room is not the long-awaited command to return to San Pedro. Instead, it provides a set of coordinates for the heart of the enemy's most heavily fortified naval bastion, a harbor ringed by mountains and bristling with coastal guns that have been calibrated for years to hit anything that enters the bay. The crew receives the news in a silence that is heavier than the steel surrounding them. There is no cheering, no bravado. They aren't the vibrant, optimistic sailors of 1944. They are gray-skinned, hollow-eyed survivors who have spent the better part of a decade living in a floating prison. They don't write letters home because the mail ships stopped coming months ago. They simply check their stations. The Marine Guard, once tasked with preventing mutiny, now stands at the armory doors with a grim, silent understanding. Every man on this ship is already a ghost. The Iowa is fueled for one way only. To save weight for the final sprint, the last of the non-essential equipment is tossed overboard. The ship groans as the order, "All ahead flank," is relayed to the engine rooms. Down in the 130-degree hell of the boiler rooms, the Black Gang sailors push the ancient, patched-together machinery to pressures not seen since the ship's sea trials. The vibration is cataclysmic. Without the teak decking to dampen the noise, the bare steel plates of the ship scream under the strain. The Iowa, a rusted, bleeding titan, turns its bow toward the coast, cutting through the dark water at a speed that seems impossible for a vessel in such disrepair. As the ship emerges from the perpetual fog of the blockade line, she looks like a nightmare birthed from the industrial age. Her paint is gone, replaced by a jagged patchwork of rust and sea salt. Her superstructure is a skeletal silhouette of radar dishes and anti-aircraft guns, manned by sailors who have strapped themselves into their harnesses so they won't fall when the hits inevitably come. She is no longer a proud instrument of diplomacy. She is a 45,000-ton iron coffin moving at 30 knots toward a wall of fire. The shore batteries begin to find their range. The first splashes of water are the size of skyscrapers, drenching the deck in brine. The Iowa doesn't swerve. She cannot. She is a battering ram of history, a zombie of the sea, propelled by the desperation of a dying era. As the first 18-inch shell from a hidden coastal fort slams into the side of the ship, the belt armor holds, but the shockwave kills men instantly in the compartments behind it. The 16-inch guns, the pride of the American Navy, roar one last time, their muzzles flashing in the twilight like the dying gasps of a star. The ship is finally becoming what the dark timeline demanded, a tomb of iron,
sinking into the abyss and taking 2,700 souls with it. But as the smoke of the final sortie reaches its peak and the sound of tearing metal becomes deafening, the nightmare begins to dissolve. The rusted, blood-stained steel of the 1952 that never was begins to shimmer and fade. The smell of rot and ozone is replaced by the scent of floor wax and salt air. The dark horizon of the eternal war slips away, and the fog lifts to reveal a very different world. A world where the guns stayed silent, and the Iowa found a much different fate.
The smoke clears, and the roar of the guns vanishes into the stillness of a late summer morning. The rusted, jagged edges of the nightmare dissolve, replaced by the crisp white uniforms of high-ranking officers and the rhythmic lapping of the tides in Tokyo Bay. This is September 2nd, 1945. This is the reality we know. On the deck of the USS Missouri, a sister ship to the Iowa, the atmosphere isn't one of desperation or rot, but of profound, exhausted relief. There are no Oka bombs screaming from the sky, no scurvy-ridden sailors strapped to their guns, and no suicide sorties into a wall of fire. Instead, there is the scratch of a pen on parchment. With the signing of the Japanese Instrument of Surrender, the most cataclysmic conflict in human history didn't spiral into a decade-long siege. It ended. The divergence of our history from the dark timeline cannot be overstated. Had the Trinity test failed, or had the resolve for a total blockade taken precedence over the harrowing decision to use atomic weapons, the eternal blockade would have been more than a thought experiment. Military planners at the time estimated that Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, would have resulted in millions of casualties on both sides. The naval personnel, trapped in the floating iron tombs we described, would have faced the very psychological and physical degradation we explored. But in our world, the decisive battle never had to be fought. The rapid conclusion of the war meant that the men who had spent years in the claustrophobic heat of the Pacific were able to do the one thing the sailors of the dark timeline could only dream of. They went home. They traded the 130-degree engine rooms for air-conditioned diners and quiet suburbs. They traded the 1,000-yard stare for the sight of their families on the pier. The ships themselves were spared the rust plague. Instead of being cannibalized for spare parts or turned into skeletal hulks of industry, the Iowa-class battleships were recognized as the masterpieces of engineering they were. While many were mothballed or saw limited service in later conflicts like Korea and Vietnam, they were never abandoned to the elements. They didn't become zombies of the sea. They became monuments. Today, if you visit the USS Iowa in Los Angeles or the USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor, the contrast is jarring. The teak decks are meticulously maintained, glowing under the sun, rather than splintering under the boots of desperate men. The brass fittings are polished to a mirror shine, not stripped away to feed a failing war machine. The air in the berthing compartments is filtered and cool, a far cry from the suffocating, humid stench of 2,700 unwashed bodies. These museum ships stand as pristine echoes of a power that was used to secure a peace, rather than a power that consumed itself in a never-ending war. They are clean, they are silent, and they are safe. When you walk their corridors, you aren't walking through a tomb.
You are walking through a testament to the fact that the nightmare of the dark timeline remained just that, a shadow that never fell. The iron didn't swallow the men. Instead, the men brought the iron home, preserving it so that we might remember the cost of the peace they finally won. Yet, as we step back from the edge of this dark reflection, we must recognize a fundamental truth. The floating iron tomb was a fiction, but the foundation it was built upon was very, very real. The sailors of World War II didn't need a decade-long siege to experience the limits of human endurance.
For them, the 120-degree engine rooms, the suffocating humidity of the berthing decks, and the psychological weight of the 1,000-yard stare were not thought experiments. They were the daily reality for a generation tasked with saving the world. Their bravery was not merely found in the thunder of the 16-inch guns, but in the quiet grit required to live inside a steel machine for years at a time. They lived through the sensory assault, the bug juice rations, and the constant shadow of the kamikaze, all while maintaining the massive, complex heart of the fleet. We explore these dark timelines not to diminish their struggle, but to highlight just how close the world came to a much grimmer fate, and how grateful we should be that the eternal blockade remained a nightmare that never woke. In our timeline, the guns eventually fell silent. The rust plague was held at bay by the return of peace, and the men who manned the battle stations were allowed to become grandfathers rather than ghosts. We live in the wake of their success, inhabiting a world where the Pacific is a highway of trade rather than a graveyard of empires. It is a peace we often take for granted, a luxury bought with the years these men spent in the belly of the beast. There is a profound, heavy stillness that hangs over a museum ship like the USS Missouri or the USS Wisconsin. It is the sound of a weapon that has finished its work. When you walk those decks today, you aren't just walking on steel and teak. You are walking on the physical manifestation of a resolved conflict. The silence isn't an absence of life, it is the presence of peace. Next time you stand on the deck of a museum ship, listen to that silence, and be glad it's all you hear. Preserving these monolithic icons is our way of honoring the souls who lived within them. By supporting naval museums and veterans organizations, we ensure that the lessons of the past aren't buried under the waves of time. We owe it to those who served to remember the reality they endured, so that the dark timeline stays exactly where it belongs, in the realm of what if. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the shadows of history. If you value these deep dives into the turning points of our world, consider subscribing to help us keep these stories alive. Until next time, remember the cost of the ground you stand on, and cherish the peace